parents hid family debt problem for years and blamed me when collectors came to our door, forcing me to uncover the truth about their secret loans while choosing whether to protect them or save myself from losing my job and my apartment. I was packing leftover noodles into a plastic container when I heard the first knock. It sounded sharp and impatient, like someone who had knocked too many times today and was tired of being ignored. I remember how my hand froze halfway to the drawer. I had lived in that small apartment in Riverside Heights for 3 quiet years, and nobody ever knocked unless they texted first. I was 28, working at a small tech service company across town, trying to keep my life simple after a rough start in my early 20s. I liked my small routines. I liked silence. But that knock felt like trouble, and something inside me tightened before I even reached the door. When I opened it, I saw 2 men who looked tired, annoyed, and way too familiar with the expression someone has when they are about to say something you will not want to hear. One of them, a tall guy with a thinning beard, checked a paper on his clipboard and said my name like he had been repeating it all day. I said yes. He asked if my parents lived here. I told him no. He asked if I was related to Garen and Milen Kyson. I said yes again because lying felt stupid even though everything in my body told me to shut the door. The shorter man, who looked maybe mid-50s with a soft belly and a voice that carried down the hall, told me they were collectors for an unpaid loan. I felt my stomach drop. My parents were both in their late 60s and had always told me they avoided loans. They always said debt was shameful. They said we did not borrow money because only irresponsible people did that. I grew up hearing those sentences at our small table in Westford Township. I believed them. So when these 2 men said my parents owed a large amount and had listed my address as a secondary contact, I felt something crack inside me because it made no sense. I told them there had to be some mistake. The tall one shook his head. He said they had tried calling my parents. Then he said something that stung. My parents claimed I lived with them and handled their finances, which was why they put my address. I almost laughed because it sounded unreal. I hadn't lived with them since I was 19, and we barely talk except on holidays. I just stood there, trying to make sense of why my parents would drag me into something like this. The short man handed me a folded notice. I remember how my fingers shook, even though the hallway was warm. He said if the loans were not taken care of, they would have to escalate. Then they left, leaving me with the notice and a hallway that suddenly felt too quiet. I closed the door and locked it. Then sat on the floor in front of it because it felt like the only solid thing in my life at that second. I read the notice, which listed numbers that made my chest hurt. The debt amount did not look like something my parents could ever handle. It looked like someone trying to cover up years of something. Years of silence. Years of secrets. I kept reading the notice until my eyes blurred, and I knew I had to call them. Even though I didn't want to. Even though a small voice in me was scared of what I would hear. My mother picked up on the 3rd ring. She sounded distracted. I told her collectors came to my apartment. She went quiet. My dad got on the phone a moment later. He sounded annoyed, not alarmed. He asked why I opened the door. That question hit me harder than anything those collectors said. I asked why they gave my address. He muttered something about paperwork being complicated. My mother told me not to make a big deal of it. I could feel something rise in me, something old, something from the years when they always made me feel like the unreasonable one for asking questions. I asked how many loans they had taken. My mother said it was not my business. My dad told me to stay out of it. But now, the collectors had my address. I knew that more people might just show up. And the fear of losing my apartment, or my job if this escalated, made my throat tighten. I told them they needed to fix this. My dad said if I cared about family, I would help. The moment I heard that, my whole body went cold because what that sounded like was blame. It sounded like the weight of whatever they created was supposed to sit on me. I hung up after my mother started crying in that soft way she used to whenever she wanted me to stop asking things. I sat there on the floor, holding the notice and thinking of how many years they had hidden this from me, and why, and what else they never told me. After 10 minutes, I got up and looked around my apartment. My small desk. My worn couch. My little rented life. I work hard to keep everything stable. I could not let this destroy it. I knew I had to find out what they were hiding because it was clear they were not telling me the truth. And I knew that this was only the start because people who hide things never stop at one lie. They stack them up until they fall. I walked around my apartment for almost an hour before I could think clearly because everything felt shaky and unreal, and I couldn't understand how two people who always lectured me on responsibility had managed to hide something this big for so long, and I kept hearing my dad's voice telling me I should help if I cared about family. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, knowing that guessing wouldn't fix anything, and started searching the company name printed on the notice. It showed a long history of chasing overdue accounts and small lawsuits scattered across the state. I felt heat rise in my face because I could picture those collectors returning, and I could picture neighbors hearing them knock again and again, and I hated the idea of being dragged into something that had nothing to do with the life I built at 28. I typed my parents' names into the search bar, and my chest tightened when a few public filings came up that showed unpaid balances from at least 4 years ago. 4 years. That meant they were already drowning in debt during the time my mother told me everything was fine, and I worried too much, and I should focus on my work instead of asking about their situation. I sat back and stared at the screen because it hurt in a quiet way that was worse than anger. I kept remembering the times when I visited home and saw late notices tucked under stacks of mail on the counter, and when I asked about them, my dad laughed and said those were old mistakes from when he was reorganizing the bills. The lies were right in front of me back then, but I trusted them. I kept thinking about how they used my address. They knew I lived alone. They knew I didn't want any kind of trouble at my building. They knew my work depended on stability because my manager warned me twice about distractions. They knew all of that, and still marked my apartment as some kind of backup contact. I felt something break in me when I realized it wasn't an accident. It was intentional. I texted my older cousin Rowan, who was 34 and always acted like he knew more than he did, but he was the only person who ever gave me straight answers when my parents did not. I asked if he had ever heard anything about loans. He called me in a minute and asked what happened. I told him about the collectors. He went silent in that way, which told me he was thinking, not surprised. I asked again. He sighed and said he didn't know everything, but he heard my dad took money from some friend years ago for medical bills of my mother because she'd fallen at work and never wanted it reported. And then, he said something that twisted my stomach. He said he heard my dad had borrowed again to cover something to do with the property dispute of my uncle, and he might have co-signed something without reading it closely because he trusted the wrong man. I was dizzy. I asked why no one told me. Rowan says it's because my parents hate to come off as weak in front of me because I was the one who left the home first and built a life without asking for anything, and they felt embarrassed. I stared at the wall because I didn't know what to do with that. Embarrassment was not an excuse to drag me into debt collectors showing up at my door. I thanked him and ended the call. I took a long breath and dialed my parents again because I needed to hear the truth from them, but when my mother picked up, she sounded irritated, not worried. She said I should just leave the notice alone. I asked if they took out multiple loans. She didn't answer. My dad grabbed the phone and said it was complicated and that I shouldn't poke around. Heat rose to my chest. I told him I needed answers since I could lose my apartment if this got worse. He told me to stop exaggerating, that I always did that, and that nobody would take anything from me. That just snapped me a little. I told him he listed my address and now I was part of it. Again, my mother started crying softly in the background, telling me that I was upsetting her health and I needed to stop pressing them. I hung up before I said something I would regret. The room felt too small, and my heart pounded because their reactions made everything worse. They were hiding more than I thought. I could feel it. People do not panic like that unless the truth is bigger than the question. I walked to my window and watched cars pass on the street below because I needed something calm to look at. I thought about my job at the tech service office. My manager, Jalen, had already warned me about being late twice last month because I took my mother to 2 appointments on short notice. I knew if the collectors kept showing up or if anything legal landed in my mailbox, I could be pulled into a mess that might cost me my position. I worked hard for that job. I was not going to lose it. I opened the notice again and read the company name at the top. I wrote it down. Then I wrote down the account number. I knew calling them would feel humiliating, but I needed information. I needed to know what kind of debt my parents were drowning in because, obviously, they would not tell me. I called. A woman picked up and asked for verification. I gave the details. She confirmed the debt was real. Then she said something that made my hands go cold. She said this account was only one of several tied to my parents' names. I asked how many? She said she could not disclose all of them because some were handled by other agencies. I felt something tighten in my chest. I asked when the first default happened. She said 9 years ago. 9. That was when I was 19. That was when I left home for good after one of the worst arguments I ever had with my dad about responsibility and adulthood and choices. All this time they were sinking and they pretended everything was normal. I thanked the woman, ended the call, and sat in silence. The truth felt heavy and sharp because it meant my parents built a tower of lies that stretched nearly a decade. I realized I had to choose what came next. Either help them and risk my own life falling apart or protect myself and walk away from whatever they had created. Both felt impossible. Both felt like betrayal. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe. This was only the beginning. I knew I had to keep digging because there were still pieces missing and someone needed to uncover them. And that someone was me. I didn't sleep that night. My mind kept replaying it all in loops that hurt my head, and every time I closed my eyes I kept seeing those two collectors, standing in the hallway like they already knew my life was about to fall apart. I woke up, sat on the edge of the bed around 3 in the morning, and tried to make sense of the numbers on the notice again because they felt unreal. I thought about how my parents brought me up on strict rules about money, returning things if they thought they were unnecessary, guilt trips when I asked for anything outside the basic necessities, telling me debt ruins families, telling me people who borrow are careless. All those lines came back one after another until I felt sick because the very same people who drilled those beliefs into me were the ones who hid years of debt and dragged me into it without warning. By sunrise, I knew I needed to go home, to see everything for myself. I packed a small bag and left the apartment before anyone else in the building was awake. The drive to Westford Township always takes a little over an hour. Most days, it's peaceful. That morning, it was like heading toward a place that carried years of old arguments and resentment. I parked in front of the house, a pale single-story place that looked smaller every time I saw it. Mom answered the door in her robe. She looked tired in a way that made me feel a little guilty, even though I knew that guilt was the thing they used whenever they wanted me quiet. She hugged me, but her arms felt tense. Dad was at the kitchen table, reading a worn newspaper like it was still 1998. He didn't look surprised to see me. He barely looked up. I sat across from him and asked him to tell me the truth. I asked him to start from the beginning because I was done guessing. He folded the paper slowly and stared at me like he was deciding how much to admit. My mother started making coffee even though her hands were shaking. My dad finally said the first loan happened after my mother's fall at her old job because they thought her injury would hurt her chances of staying employed. They did not want anyone to know. He said they borrowed again to help my uncle with a property issue that spiraled into legal fees they did not plan for. I listened without interrupting, but the more he talked the more I realized he was leaving out pieces. He spoke in circles. He said they were trying to protect the family. He said loans were temporary solutions that got out of hand. I asked why they used my address. My mother looked at the floor. My dad said they needed a stable contact. Hearing that almost made me laugh because stability was the one thing I fought for after leaving home. I asked why they told collectors that I handled their finances. My mother said they panicked. I said that lie could destroy my job. She said she did not think it through. Then my dad said something that made the room feel colder. He said they thought I would step in if things became too much. I felt something sharp twist inside my chest because it meant they did not trust me to live my own life. They saw me as an emergency plan. I stood up and walked to the living room because I needed space to breathe. I looked around at the old photos on the shelves. One of me at 16. One of my parents smiling at a picnic. One of my uncle holding a huge fish like he just saved the whole family. All these pictures looked honest, but the truth behind them was not. My mother followed me and tried to hold my arm. I asked her how much they owed in total. She did not answer. My dad called from the kitchen and said that numbers did not matter. I told him they mattered to me because collectors had already found my door. My mother started crying again. My dad told me I was young and strong and could handle a little pressure. I felt the rise of anger so fast, I had to step outside. I stood in the yard and tried to cool my head because the thought of losing my apartment, or my job because of lies I never agreed to, made my hands shake. I called Rowan again because he understood things my parents refused to say. I told him what I heard. He sighed and told me there were rumors in the family that my dad borrowed money from a coworker years ago, then never paid him back. The coworker told others. My dad got embarrassed and refused to talk about it. Then he borrowed again from another friend. Then from a credit group. Then from a local lender. It stacked until they could not keep track. Hearing that made me feel like my whole childhood had been built on a script, not reality. I thanked Rowan and ended the call. I walked back inside because I needed the final answer that only my parents could give. I stood in front of them and asked if they expected me to pay everything. My dad stared at me like I had insulted him. My mother said they just needed help with one part. I asked how much. She whispered a number that made my knees feel weak. It was far beyond anything I could ever cover without losing my apartment, and maybe even my work position. I told them I could not do that. My dad said if I walked away I was abandoning family. He said real family stayed when things were ugly. I told him real family did not lie for 9 years and drag their kid into debts that were never his. My mom just kept apologizing and didn't offer any solutions, so I just sat there. Then my dad said something that silenced the room. He said if I refused to help, they might lose the house. Because the house held my whole childhood, the good parts, the bad parts all mixed. I felt this mix of guilt and anger twist together. I told them I'd think about it. I drove back to my apartment with a headache that felt like pressure behind my eyes. By the time I reached my parking spot, I still had not decided what to do. I stood there looking at my building, thinking about how much I worked to protect my life. I knew I would have to choose soon, because collectors do not wait, and lies do not stay hidden forever. I spent the next morning sitting on my couch with the blinds half closed, because sunlight felt too sharp for the kind of choices I had to make. Mostly, I thought about how my dad looked at me when he said losing the house was a possibility, and even though I was angry, it still hit something inside me that I did not want to feel. I opened my laptop and started listing every bill I had, every expense, every backup I kept in case of emergencies, because I needed to see the truth on paper. I knew I could not hand over the amount my mother whispered. It would break my life in ways that would take years to recover from. But I also knew walking away would create a cut between us that might never heal. I tried calling my mom again around noon, and she answered with a small voice that made her sound older than she really was. I asked if she and my dad ever talked to a financial advisor. She said no. She said they felt ashamed. I told her shame wasn't a plan. She went quiet. I asked her if there were more loans she hadn't mentioned. She cried and said yes. That answer landed like a weight in my stomach because it meant everything I heard the day before was only part of the truth. I asked how many? She said she did not know. The word itself made my jaw clench because not knowing meant complete chaos. My dad took the phone from her and told me they would figure it out on their own. He said I had done enough harm. Hearing that, something inside me started to harden because it proved that he wanted help without giving honesty. I hung up. I grabbed my keys because sitting in the apartment made me think in circles. I drove to the small legal clinic downtown because they offered free consultations. I waited almost an hour in a small lobby smelling of old carpet and stale air while I kept tapping my foot because I felt torn between fear and determination. When a lawyer called my name, I followed him into a narrow office and explained everything from the collectors who showed up at my door to the loans I never knew existed. I told him about my job and how fragile my situation was. He listened without interrupting. Then he told me the part that I needed to hear. I had no legal obligation to pay anything unless my name was on the debt or unless I had signed something. I felt breath return to my chest because that meant my life was not legally tied to their mistakes. He said the collectors using my address was messy but not enough to attach liability to me. I asked what I should do. He said to send a written notice to the collectors that I am not responsible for the debt and they should not contact my address again. He said I should advise my parents to seek credit counseling, but their debts were theirs alone. I thanked him even though my hands were trembling because the relief felt like a sharp, strange thing. The drive back home felt lighter, but also painful, since knowing I was safe meant I had to confront what that safety cost. I sat down at my kitchen table and wrote the notice the lawyer advised. I sent it that same afternoon so that I wouldn't be able to second guess myself afterward. Then I called my parents again, because I wanted to be honest without being cruel. My mother picked up. I told her I went to a legal clinic. I told her the collectors had no right to involve me. I told her I would not pay their debts. There was a long silence until she asked whether I could at least help them talk to someone who was able to explain things. I said yes, but only if they would be open about everything. She said she would try. My dad refused to come to the phone. That alone told me he was still mired in pride and denial. I hung up with mixed feelings that made my chest feel tight. I stepped out on my balcony because I needed air. I watched people walk dogs and push strollers and talk about normal things, and I wondered how many of them were carrying secrets from their parents or hiding mistakes themselves. Around 6 in the evening, my phone buzzed. A message came from my mother. She said she talked to my dad and he would agree to meet with a counselor if I set it up. I was hit with a complicated mix of relief and sadness because I knew progress didn't erase the years of lies. I spent the next hour searching for a counselor who specialized in debt cases. I found one in the next town. I booked an appointment for them. I sent my mother the details. She thanked me. My dad didn't. Later that night, I walked around my apartment thinking over everything that happened. I thought about the arguments from years before, about the expectations they laid on me, about how they cinched my sense of responsibility and fear, and how all those lessons were twisted by the truth that had been hiding behind them. I thought about how easily family can expect sacrifice without offering honesty in return. I thought about the small boy I used to be who tried so hard to impress them because I believed they had everything figured out. I knew now they were just people with flaws and fears and mistakes that grew too fast for them to control. I sat on the floor with my back to the wall and let myself feel all of it without trying to solve anything. I realized I could help them find the right professionals, but I couldn't carry their debt. I could guide them, but I couldn't fix them. I could stay connected, but I couldn't let their choices destroy the life I worked for. That was my line. That was my choice. The next morning, I forwarded the collector's notice to the agency again just to be certain. I emailed my parents the information for the counselor. I told them I cared but also told them I was protecting my home and my job. Mom wrote me back a short message saying she understood. Dad sent nothing. I stood at the window and watched the street come alive with people rushing to work. I felt steady for the first time in days. I knew the debt would take time for them to confront. I knew things between us would not return to the way it was. But I also knew I'd told the truth, and I'd chosen a path that didn't leave me broken. Sometimes protecting family means stepping in. Sometimes it means stepping back. I was doing both in the only way I could.